We're speaking today with Ambassador Dore Gold, and from here at the President's Conference in Jerusalem. Very productive conference. You were there yesterday, sir, and got a chance to see it firsthand. What were your impressions, first off, of the Presidential Conference tomorrow, 2013?
Well, it's a huge event. I mean, it's kind of an ingathering of Middle East experts, entertainers, some VIPs. It's caused some debate in Israel, but most importantly, the session I took part in was a place where a number of views were presented, and the sparks were flying at different times.
And this is one of the things that I like about the Presidential Conference, is that it doesn't present just a single point of view on a lot of issues, not just politics either. There's science, there's culture that's going on there. Very vibrant conference to participate in.
That's true.
Absolutely.
Israel is a country with its democracy. It has multiple views. It has real challenges, and people coming with totally different solutions about how to deal with them.
Ambassador, obviously there's always issues of great import when it comes to Israel. You live in a difficult region of the world, arguably more difficult now than it's been for quite a while. It's been a couple of years since the start of the Arab Spring. We've seen what's happened in Egypt, in Libya. Now we're seeing what's happening in Syria. There's a great debate on in the West about whether or not the West should be intervening in the Syrian conflict, and if so, how. You've got obviously plenty of experience in the diplomatic circles, especially at the UN. You've seen how these debates rage. What do you think the West should be doing in regards to Syria, and how do you see the efforts going so far?
Well, I think we have to divide Syria into two subject areas. One is the strategic interests of the United States and its Western allies like Israel. And the second is the very difficult moral dilemma which President Obama and the other Western allied leaders are facing. On the strategic side, it would be a disaster for Syria and Iran to come out victorious from the current confrontation. You have to remember, Iran is a country with hegemonial ambitions. It's seeking to get into Yemen and sends weapons ships to the Arabian Peninsula for that purpose. It's seeking to dominate Bahrain. It has now dominated the politics of Iraq. There is a Shiite prime minister, Mr. al-Maliki, who is aligned with Iran. It now has boots on the ground, Iranian soldiers in the Syrian civil war who are shooting Sunni Arabs. And of course, through Hezbollah, it has been involved in Lebanon and in, of course, Syria for a number of years. So that's the array. And in the midst of all this, the Iranians are trying to get a nuclear bomb. What you would like to see as a result is that Iran has to sort of roll up its tarpaulin and go back to Persia and not be involved in the Mediterranean area, in the Levant. And that can only happen if Mr. Assad is defeated. At the same time, you want to make sure who replaces him is not Osama bin Laden's first cousin, but rather non-Al-Qaeda, non-radical Islamic elements. And that's going to require a lot of very careful diplomacy. That's the strategic side. On the national, let's call it humanitarian side, the United States is a superpower. In the 1990s, when it saw people were being slaughtered in Srebrenica in Bosnia, it decided to intervene for humanitarian reasons. Now, some people would think that that's wrong. Later in Kosovo, the same motivation. Now, you don't have to have more U.S. troops on the ground in Syria. And the United States has the strongest air force in the world. And therefore, if you are seeing that tens of thousands of people are going to be slaughtered, then you have to decide whether you use that air power to protect them and prevent a disaster from occurring or not.
What do you think the lesson is from what happened in Libya in regards to Syria? Are those two situations analogous, first of all?
Well, Libya was a disaster for a number of reasons. Number one, the West wouldn't coordinate with the Russians, and therefore the Russians now have it in for the West in Syria. They feel that a resolution was adopted in the Security Council, and the United States simply, with its British and French allies, ignored the exact language of the resolution. You gotta repair things with the Russians. There's a lot of common ground, even though Putin wants to restore the Soviet Empire in some way or another.
Right.
That's number one. Number two, weaponry. You have to remember all these states in the past, many of them were Soviet client states. Take a look at Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Look at Libya. Look at Assad's Syria. And as Soviet client states, they had huge arsenals of weaponry. Huge arsenals. I mean, the Iraqi conventional weapons are moving all over the Middle East. In Libya, the Libyan arsenal has gone as far as Mali and Algeria on one side of the Middle East and all the way over to the Gaza Strip. We now have shoulder-fired missiles that can take down aircraft in Gaza from Libya. So you don't want to make that mistake again and have the Syrian arsenal spreading out to the Middle East in the hands of the next generation of terrorists.
So this prompts the question, how do you prevent that outcome, the Libyan outcome, from occurring in Syria while not putting boots on the ground there to determine the outcome?
Well, you're going to need a local partner or several local partners, and you've got to come to agreement with them of who are the bad guys who have to be weakened and who are the relatively okay guys you can work with. But you have to do that. And you have to work. The Russians actually have an interest. The Russians are scared of radical Islam because of Chechnya, Dagestan, and the whole area of the Caucasus. So although we all have our differences with Russia over Iran and perhaps over other aspects of Russian policy, it could be that on Syria you could get a meeting of the minds, but that requires real diplomatic skill.
I want to shift over to Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Obviously a conflict that's been going on for decades. Do you see any correlation between that and the Western debate as to whether or not to be involved in Syria and that sort of thing? Do you think that the West is engaged enough in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or do you think that the West is too engaged?
Well, I believe the only ones that can solve this conflict are the parties themselves. That is how it has always worked. I remember when President Jimmy Carter was planning on a big Geneva conference with the Soviet Union, with the PLO, with Arab states, and he sent Cyrus Vance to the region to put together the foundations for this new Geneva conference in '77. There were two leaders in the Middle East who got scared. One was named Anwar Sadat. The other was named Menachem Begin. And all the men of very different backgrounds. They sent envoys to Morocco and got moving the Sadat visit to Jerusalem and eventually the full peace agreement. These are the ones who make peace. Our peace treaty with Jordan was done directly between Israelis and Jordanians. Even the Oslo agreements, they have a lot of problems in them between Israel and the PLO. They were done in Oslo, Norway, while the United States was sponsoring some other peace talks in Washington. It's the parties themselves who delivered agreements. And I know that there's a tendency in Western capitals to think, well, what can we do to make it happen? Well, you can't want peace more than the parties themselves.
Well, this is the key. How badly do the parties themselves want peace? In your perspective, is the issue that one side or both sides aren't yet invested enough in peace?
Well, look, let me be, I'm not going to go into the propaganda route.
Right.
I don't want to say, we did all this, the Palestinians said no. I'm not interested in that. Looking at this from 100,000 feet, get up in the air and look down at the conflict, what you will find is that we have now gone through 7 Israeli prime ministers, 3 American presidents, 2 Palestinian leaders, and no one has reached the permanent status agreement ending the conflict. And it maybe indicates that the gap between the parties in many of these issues are unbridgeable. I mean, there are issues that people can't solve. Nobody has solved Kashmir. They came closer to solving Cyprus, but that still remains unresolved. There's the Kuril Islands where the Russians are sitting on Japanese territory. And it could
Taiwan's another issue.
And Taiwan is always out there. So what I am trying to say is that you have to give an evaluation whether this is a bridgeable conflict or parts of it are simply unbridgeable, and we're not going to get to a full final status agreement. Perhaps we can get to a more limited agreement if the parties are willing to make that effort. But one of the mistakes that's often made is that, particularly in Washington, where the U.S. has the lead, is that people go, oh yeah, we can do this. You know, I'll just sit down with Mahmoud Abbas and with Bibi Netanyahu, and you know what, 2 weeks, we'll be finished. There was also that whole process under President Clinton at Camp David in July 2000, later at Taba between the parties in the beginning of 2001, and you had a number of ex-officials running around saying, we all know what the solution is, we all know it already, all we need is a political tunnel to get there. Well, come on, you didn't deliver it, so lay off. Come to the conclusion that certain aspects of this conflict are not going to be resolved. The Israelis are not going to divide Jerusalem. People should get that through their head. Public opinion is overwhelmingly against it. In a region in which there's so much uncertainty and so much danger, for us to get out of the Jordan Valley, which is the front line of our defense, would be an act of national irresponsibility. So that's not going to happen. Now, can we structure a peace arrangement given those two factors? It's a lot of work, but we have to try.
Ambassador Gold, I want to talk to you just briefly about what you're doing now. You've gone into a nonprofit advisory role here in Israel, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Tell us a little bit about what your efforts are there and what the center does.
Well, one of the things I've found in government is that in government you don't have time to do longer term work. You know, I remember being in Prime Minister Netanyahu's office and someone said, the French foreign minister is coming in 20 minutes. Where are the talking points of the foreign ministry? They haven't arrived. We've got to write them ourselves. So everything is rather urgent. And, you know, let's say you want to say, okay, Israel, what is its message in the peace process? Well, one of the messages is that Israel has a right to defensible borders under Resolution 242 of the UN Security Council. Let's define what those defensible borders are and get that message out. So we have done that. We produced a booklet. It's available on our website, www.jcpa.org, about Israel's requirements for defensible borders, with Google Earth maps and a lot of history, all appearing there. In 2011, I took two generals who helped me with this booklet, and we went to the House Foreign Affairs Committee and presented it under Representative Ross Letnin, who really put this meeting together. We oftentimes appear on television in various countries. I've done a number of Fox shows. My French department head, Ambassador Freddy Eitan, has been all over France, 24. And so we're trying to get our message out in multiple languages and in multiple countries.
Ambassador Dore Gold, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure.